Have you ever had a wait, what did you just say moment? Like, I must not have heard that right. Well, there's something like that in this episode, and it has to do with genocide. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. I interrupted a conversation in the last episode. Moses and God were talking, and I cut it off before God could finish what God was saying. I'm going to correct that now, but before I get back to Exodus 3, which is where that conversation was happening, I'm going to take a little step back. According to Jewish tradition, Moses' life can be divided into three 40-year portions, each representing a key period in his life. 40 years in Egypt, culminating in his escape, fleeing for hundreds of miles and ending up in Midian. 40 years in Midian, where he marries, has children, becomes Midianite for all practical intents and purposes, and lives a quiet life as a shepherd. His final 40-year period will be spent leading Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness, where Moses helps establish them as a people with leadership and religious life, patterns of justice, and systems of law. Now, I take that 40-40-40 pattern as a sort of template, not literally or exactly a description of Moses' history, but indicative of stages in his development as a person and the roles in life that he gets drawn into. The books of Moses do tell us that Moses lived 120 years, and if we take that and match it with the traditional account of the 340s, then where we are as we start to explore Exodus chapter 3, with Moses now at the age of 80, is that he's 2/3 of the way through his life. He's at a point in life something akin to what we might think of as late midlife in our society, something like me when I turned into my 50s or turned into my 60s. And I'm 68 as I'm creating this episode, by the way. Moses has more years in his rearview mirror than he has left in front of him. But at the same time, there are decades of experiences in that rearview mirror, all stored up and banked in his account, as it were. As we've observed in earlier episodes, those experiences and that life that Moses has lived comprise a hybrid mix of families and cultures and languages and religions. He's also experienced rejection, fear, danger, and what I would call failure. And courage. He fled into the wilderness and wandered alone and vulnerable for hundreds of miles to get to Midian, driven by an absolute desperation brought on by the fact that if he had stayed in Egypt, he would have been arrested and killed. Now, granted, those circumstances were a result of his own actions, killing an Egyptian to stop him from beating an Israelite slave, but his flight to Midian nonetheless required a profound measure of courage. The last episode focused on Moses in Midian, and where he was tending the sheep of his father-in-law, and it focused on an encounter on a sacred mountain, and a flaming bush, and a voice from those flames. And where we left off was at a midpoint in the message which that voice was delivering. That's the conversation that I interrupted. And the last words we heard before I cut God off were these: "Do not come any closer. Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. I'm the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob." And then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Elohim. Now that's where I cut things off. God is about to go on speaking. And in the last episode, I unpacked a lot of the things that were in those verses that I just read, and also the verses prior to that. At any rate, verse 7 now picks it up with God still speaking. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I've come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land, to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I've seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore come now, and I'll send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. That short passage is packed with information, and for me, packed with questions. There's information about the divine nature. There's information about human agency, about God's relationship to nations and peoples, and whether God has favorites. There's information about land. And each of those items of information, as I just said, raises questions for me. Well, let's first look at what it tells us about the author's view of God. The text tells us that God sees and becomes aware. Literally, it says, "Seeing, I have seen." God has seen the afflictions specifically of the Israelites here, and God hears the cry of people. The seeing and the crying out seem to be how God comes to know what's happening. The text portrays a divine being that relies on sensory experience for information, in other words. As a result of such information, we're told, God comes down, which is implying physical relocation from one place to another. And God does so with a purpose, so God has plans. In this case, those plans are to deliver people out of the bondage and oppression they're in. Now, it's important, I think, to recognize the raw anthropomorphism in these texts. Seeing, hearing, speaking, those all require physical sense organs. Coming to know things through sensory experiences could suggest that the author thinks that God didn't know those things prior to having those experiences. And coming down to do something implies physical movement from one place to another. Now, I read a narrative like this as I read a work of art, and so I expect authors to use a range of literary methods and tools to communicate metaphor, analogy, simile, etc. So the anthropomorphism actually doesn't create questions for me. I'm able to appreciate the dramatic power and the artistic impact of such literary devices while I hold to a view of the divine which is not anthropomorphic. I take these references as part of the story, not as literal definitions of God's being or even character. But I have other questions from the text about the divine nature that I think are actually more significant and, at least for me, more troubling. So, although God sees and knows the plight of the Israelites, the reality is that knowing this didn't lead to immediate action. The enslavement of the Israelites has been going on for decades by this time. So why the delay? Why allow such conditions to continue? Why allow them to begin in the first place? And of course, human history, at both a macro, global, international scale and at the micro, individual level, is full of similar examples of suffering with delayed intervention, or indeed without any divine intervention at all. So assuming there is a God, and assuming that God sees and hears and is aware, and assuming that God would want to end the suffering and the oppression that they see and know, why the delay? Why the silence? Why the inaction? In other words, questions like these emerge. Does God see and care? Does God know? Can God do anything about it? If so, why wait? And in some cases, why never act at all? So ultimately, it begs the question, well, then, is there a God after all? Now, although this is a story about an emancipation event, and although the narrative is building up to build expectations about that, there is at the same time this undercurrent of the question, why? And the collection of Hebrew sacred texts that we call the canon of the Bible, if we're from Christian backgrounds, has answers to 4 of the 5 questions I just posed. And those answers are these. Well, yes, there is a God, according to the Hebrew sacred texts. And yes, God does care. And yes, God does know. And yes, God can stop evil, can intervene. But there is no answer to this 5th question. Why doesn't God do something? It's a question that many of the Hebrew sacred texts ask relentlessly, actually. But the reality is that they are never really able to offer an answer. The closest answer that I've found in those sacred texts seems to be that of Job, which in essence was this: now I understand that I don't understand. You're God, and I'm not. I can't understand, but I trust you. That's the closest thing to an answer. I think it summarizes, the answer of the Hebrew sacred tradition. The story of the Exodus and the emancipation out of Egypt of the people of Israel is an example of the way that these sacred texts of the Israelites tend to marry the goodness of God, that God does deliver and act, with this persistent, inescapable reality of the problem of evil. Why does God allow what God allows? That marriage begins actually at the very beginning of the books of Moses, back in Genesis, which we surveyed in previous episodes. There is a good and beautiful creation revealing the goodness and beauty of God. And yet the first humans succumb to the wiles of a crafty deceiver whose origins are never explained. Nor is there a reason given for why the personification of such crafty evil was allowed access to humans in order to deceive them in this otherwise good and beautiful world. This all adds more data to how Moses would answer the questions that I've posed when having conversations with John and the Buddha. What's real, what's wrong, and how to fix it. So, for example, some of what the books of Moses would contribute are these. What's real in the books of Moses? Well, God, and God's goodness, and God's living, vital activity, and yet also the fact that God allows there to be something wrong and delays in fixing it. And what is it that went wrong? Well, there is evil and there is suffering, not just as a consequence of the mistaken uses of human free will, but even prior to that, according to Genesis. There is a living, intelligent evil that is presumed, but never explained in the books of Moses, and that's part of what went wrong. And the fix, according to the books of Moses, and this will show up later in Exodus relative to how Moses understands the fix, or at least more than what I'm about to say will show up later in the books of Moses and later in Exodus, to understand how Moses understands the fix. But so far, the answer to what is the fix, so far what we know from Exodus is that the fix involves God doing something, taking action, coming down, lifting up, delivering. And at the same time, God doesn't act alone, at least not always. The fix is not purely divine, we might say, and this is about to become clearer in what the text tells us that God says next to Moses. And it has to do with human agency. God tells Moses, I will send you so that you may bring my people out of Egypt. So God plans to take action, but in and with a person. In this case, in collaboration, we might say, with Moses. So there's divine action, I'm going to come down and do this, and there's human action, you're going to do it. God will do it, Moses will do it. God sends, Moses goes. Human and divine agency are not presented as either or in this portion of the sacred texts. It's a both and. Divine agency is working in and through human agents throughout the sacred texts of Israel, actually. The human agents might be individuals like Moses or Abraham, as we saw earlier. It could also be nations like Israel. But to be clear, it isn't just Israelite individuals and not just Israel as a nation that are human agents in the co-working, we might say, of divine agency. The human agents in and with whom God is said to work are not just the so-called good guys. Indeed, individual Israelites and the nation of Israel itself can't be portrayed simply as the good guys based on the Hebrew sacred text. They are frequently as bad or worse than the peoples who are not referred to in the Hebrew scriptures as chosen. So while God is the initiator and creator and clearly the lead agent in the books of Moses, it's clear that this God does not operate outside the system, we might say. Divine agency is embodied in and with human agency. And sometimes there are even non-human co-agents as well, like nature and other beings, but I'm going to focus here on the divine and human agency. Right, well, I've looked at some questions about God's nature and the reality of evil and of how God works in the world according to the books of Moses, but I mentioned that the references to land and the way God refers to Israel as my people also raise questions for me. So I want to take those up, and I'm going to start with the question of my people. Here's verse 10 again. Therefore, come now, and I'll send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. My people. Israel as God's chosen people is a theme and thread that emerges consistently throughout the Hebrew sacred texts. And it can be, and has been, taken in a very extreme and exclusive sense, as if God is only ultimately concerned with one nation or people to the exclusion of others. But there is another major theme or set of themes running throughout those same texts which should also be taken into account. Without taking another entire episode to go more deeply into this, here are just some bullet points taken only from the books of Moses, since that's the friend I'm currently talking with. So first, all humanity is made in God's image, back in Genesis 1. All peoples are to be blessed through the descendants of Abraham, Genesis 12. Strangers and aliens from other peoples are to be cared for. That's one of the Mosaic laws of Exodus 22. All the nations are assigned by God to the care of angelic sons of God in Deuteronomy 32. The B'nai Elohim in Hebrew, according to the version of the text found among what are called the Dead Sea Scrolls. That last text does, if we read it in its full context, single out Israel as somehow uniquely belonging to Elohim, or Yahweh, God. But it clearly shows that the governance of the nations was assigned to divine or even angelic care and governance from God's desire that they be cared for. And these examples indicate that the books of Moses never lost sight of the universal purpose and the care of God for all human beings, every culture, language, every nation. And that leads me to conclude that the reference to my people in Exodus 3 should not in any way suggest to us some sort of extreme form of the exclusion of all the other peoples. In fact, in the Hebrew texts, if there is a position of special privilege at all for Israel, and later prophetic texts actually question this, by the way, then it seems to be a position of responsibility for doing good and blessing others, other peoples and nations, as part of the divine human co-agency that we explored a little bit earlier relative to Moses. Now, as an aside, I'm creating this episode in the summer of 2026. And right now there's war happening between the United States and Iran. There's war in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon. And this whole question of Israel relative to other nations and the question of what it would mean for, say, Christians to, quote-unquote, support Israel is extremely relevant right now. In briefest form, since this is not the main purpose of the podcast, my conclusion from the discussion we're having right now is that support for Israel should center in supporting Israel in their role of blessing other peoples. That obviously has implications for how I view the wars that are taking place right now. Well, back to the main discussion. I want to move to the question of land in the passage, which is also incredibly relevant right now. The land. So God plans to collaborate with Moses to bring Israel out of Egypt. However we want to understand Israel as God's people, the plan is, let's get them out of Egypt and go where? Well, that was specified in verse 8 of Exodus 3. Bring them up from that land, Egypt, to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Well, so far this sounds wonderful. Of course, the problem is that this wonderful place is already occupied. Specifically, it is the land of, quote, the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Now, geographically, this is actually the same location that was promised to Abraham back in Genesis. And it's sometimes said that Abraham didn't get to see or experience the fulfillment of that promise of land. That's true relative to the promise he was given about having a multitude of descendants. But as we noted in another episode in our survey of Genesis, Abraham actually did get to live in the land. He lived there. Genesis tells us that he coexisted there as a covenant ally with other nations and chieftains and kings. That period of coexistence came to an end for a variety of reasons, and ultimately famine drove Israel to Egypt, and so to the portion of their history that we're now exploring. But it was a model of one way that God could fulfill the promise of land for the people of Israel, coexistence. But now we're no longer focused on Abraham, are we? This is Moses, and it's years and years later. So if Israel is going to be taken back to that land that had been promised, exactly what are we to expect will happen when they get there? And I can only think of 4 options. 1, coexistence, as in what I've called the Abraham model. 2, conquering and subjugation. Now, that can go one of 2 ways, of course. Just because they go there doesn't mean they're going to conquer and subjugate. Either Israel will be victorious and subjugate the others, or vice versa. In the latter case, Israel would end up right back where they began prior to the Exodus event. Not literally in Egypt, but probably as enslaved people again. But if Israel wins, and they become the conquerors, then they would need to subjugate and likely enslave the local inhabitants. A third choice or option. There's coexistence, conquering and subjugation, and then there's conquering and forced expulsion. So we're going to conquer, and we're not going to keep you as enslaved peoples. We're going to kick you out. If Israel wins, the others leave. And then where do they go? If Israel loses, then they leave. And where do they go? They continue to wander as a displaced people. And then there's one more option, annihilation. If Israel wins, she exterminates all the others. And of course, if she loses, then annihilation means Israel gets erased. So what actually is the plan? Which of those possible futures is what is in view when God tells Moses he's taking Israel to the land of those 6 peoples? What exactly was the plan? Well, it was door number 4, annihilation. According to Deuteronomy chapter 20, which is the 5th of the books of Moses, God instructed Moses and Israel to completely destroy all the peoples in the land and to make no treaties with them. That's annihilation. It's extermination. And there's another word for it, genocide. And this is that point at which, we're hearing this right. And I think sometimes Christians have skimmed over this stuff. Sometimes Christian pastors will spiritualize all this as if it's all about spiritual warfare. But or make excuses for it in some other way. But it is genocide. Now, both archaeology and the biblical record tell us that a total annihilation never took place. There was a conquering of the peoples and a subjugation or maybe partial subjugation of them at some point. It's unclear just exactly how completely or fully this ever really happened. But the books of Moses tell us that annihilation of 6 other entire nations was the direction given to Moses by God. The fact that the command was not carried out fully shouldn't shield us from feeling the full force of the command itself, because it reveals how the author understood the purposes and the aims and the goals of God. And that was the total extermination of entire peoples, men, women, and children. Now again, the author believes that this was God's plan and purpose. Therefore, it is a statement about God's nature and a claim about the nature of ultimate reality, the source of all that exists. In other words, it's part at least of the author of the books of Moses' answer to the question I've talked about with the Buddha and John, what's real? This is part of what's real. And frankly, this raises the question, if this is in the books of Moses, and if this is Moses, how can I be friends with this guy? It's one of the most difficult issues in my friendship with Moses, to be honest. One of my most difficult issues with the Hebrew texts. The text tells us that Moses thought this extermination, or at least the author thought this extermination, was God's command. And if he was right, then I have a bigger problem than just being friends with Moses, don't I? My understanding of the divine nature is at stake, or at least my opinion of these texts is at stake. So how to deal with all this? I want to remind us about the material I referred to earlier. The books of Moses tell us that all humanity is made in God's image, and that God's intention is to bless all peoples. And that begs the question, how can a command to completely exterminate 6 nations serve those 2 realities? How does that reflect a belief that all people are made in the image of God? And how does that serve the purpose of blessing all peoples? Well, let's look at that riddle a little more deeply. It presents a difficult set of questions. I find so much of value and goodness in the books of Moses and in the Hebrew sacred text. So how do I deal with this? Let me set it up as clearly as I can. The text says that Moses heard that God said to totally annihilate the 6 nations. There's 3 things there, right? The text says Moses heard God said. Well, I think there's several options here. One option is that all 3 of those are correct, that's exactly what happened. The text is correct in reporting what Moses heard, and what Moses heard was that God actually said, go kill them all. Another option is that only 1 out of the 3 are correct, meaning the text is right in reporting what Moses heard, but Moses is incorrect in what he thought God said. In other words, Moses didn't hear it right. The text is right in reporting what Moses thinks he heard, but what he thinks he heard is not what God said. So Moses was wrong, and thus the report of what God said is wrong. Another option is that none of the 3 are correct. Maybe the text wasn't accurate in reporting what Moses says he heard, and therefore what it says Moses says he heard isn't what he heard, nor is it what God said. Now, I know that those last 2 options create problems for people who hold certain views of the divine inspiration of these texts. But for me, there's a more serious question. And that more serious question is this concern about the moral picture presented if we take option 1. In other words, if we believe that the text represents what God really wanted, the total annihilation of 6 entire nations, I think we have a bigger issue on our hands than just how can we say whether these texts were inspired or not. I think if we face the text honestly, and we receive the full force of its implications and ask ourselves What would we say today to someone who comes to us and says, God told me we need to destroy an entire nation, no survivors, no peace treaties? Sounds similar to somebody who said wiping out an entire civilization recently. But I mean, isn't it obvious what our answer to that would be? In addition to that, there's also just too much other evidence in the Bible itself, and even within the books of Moses themselves, for me to accept that total annihilation was actually God's command here. There's too much else in the scriptures that says, no, that is not what God is like. One example, if God wants to bless the nations, then annihilation of 6 of them would seem to be off the table, would it not? And for me, even more compelling is that I'm also evaluating this portrait of reality in the books of Moses based on how I've been shaped by my friends John, who presents Jesus, and the Buddha. And I simply cannot imagine a scenario in which the Buddha and Jesus would say to Moses, yeah, green light, go kill them all. There's another question, of course. Did Moses get it wrong? Or did the author who's crafting this narrative have it wrong? The text itself can't actually provide that answer, of course. I'm inclined to assume that the text reports accurately what Moses thought he heard from God, but that Moses got that wrong. But I can't argue that from the text. I'd say the same, by the way, about some of the Mosaic laws, for example, that require the death penalty for things like Sabbath breaking, dishonoring parents. It just seems like a death penalty for those infractions seems over the top. And I can't imagine that Moses got that right. Again, if I stand with the Buddha and Jesus and say, what do you guys think of this? I can't imagine Moses would have got the green light. And that means that my friendship with Moses can sift out some of the ugly stuff and the shadow stuff. He was a person of his time. And I see enough in the good elements of the books of Moses to be able to eat the meat and spit out the bones and assume that there's just some things that he didn't get right. And those bones are not part of God's character and purpose, even when something is reported as direct divine speech, like, go kill them all. There's just too much evidence against that being God's nature elsewhere in these same sacred texts. And again, as I've said a couple of times, when I bring John and the Buddha into the conversation, I just know that they would say no. So my conclusion then is something like this. Moses, you got that wrong. That vision of the divine nature, Moses, that is not what God is like. Or going back to my analogy of the aliens and the truck really early in this whole podcast, this is a point at which I think Moses isn't just touching a different part of the same truck that my friends all have their hands on. I think at this point, whatever Moses has touched here, wherever this idea came from, is not the truck. He's touching something else. Well, how does Moses respond to this, what's so far been pretty much a monologue from God? Basically describing who God is, what God has seen, what God wants to do, and the plan to send Moses to somehow be a collaborative partner in doing it. This is the point where Moses gets a chance to speak and to respond to what God's been saying. And so verse 11 says, Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And that launches a really significant dialogue that reveals a lot about how Moses relates to God and how God relates to Moses. And honestly, it takes us into a section that's one of the main sources of my friendship with Moses. It's one of the reasons I feel affinity for this man. But to get into all of that, I'm going to need more time, and so that will happen next time.